you for joining us today. My name is Yongki and I'm a senior associate at Sky Legal PC. Today, we are going to talk about E2 visa options for low investment amounts and high risk E2 visa cases. And we are very lucky to have our firm's partner, Kelly Weiner, as the speaker for this webinar. I will be covering the first half of our presentation and Kelly will take over the rest. Before we dive in, let me briefly introduce our firm and go over a few housekeeping items. We are a full-service immigration law firm, and we offer services in a wide range of areas, including E2, O1, TN, H1B, any types of employment-based or family-based green card cases. That said, we are especially well known for our work with the E2 visa case. We have built a strong reputation in this area, and we have processed hundreds of E2 visa cases. Many of them were high risk cases, and we have worked with the US consular offices all over the world. One particular reason for this the E2 visa focus is that our firm was established on E2 visa by our firm's founder Ian Scott himself. That's why we know a lot about the E2 visa world. At the end of this webinar, we'll send you several useful tools. A copy of the PowerPoint presentation we'll go through today, a link where you could download the guidelines with more details on visa options, a link to sign up for additional webinars, a link to webinar recording on YouTube. We definitely encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly post immigration related videos. And finally, a link where you can sign up a private consultation with us. Finally, for any questions, please type them into the chat box or Q&A box. We'll address those questions at the end of presentation. And with that, let's get started. So E2 visa is basically based on a treaty agreement between the United States and foreign country. And currently, United States have signed that agreement with more than 80 countries. The list of E2 countries occasionally change, but not that often. Like every few years, few countries would be added or fall off from the list. So you should check the official E2 visa countries list before you actually submit your E2 visa applications. But keep in mind that you do not need to be born from the treaty country. So you just need to hold the passport from the treaty country. So, for example, let's say you were born in India, which is not a treaty country with the United States, unfortunately yet, but later you immigrant to Canada. And if you have a Canadian passport right now, then you are eligible for the E2 visa. And you must have at least 50%, half of the E2 company's ownership. The corporation type does not matter, but we usually recommend LLC or C Corp because these are the types that giving you kind of simple and clear supporting documents. You could have a business partner. For example, if you are Canadian and your business partner who owns the other 50% of a company ownership has, let's say, Italian passport, then your business partner could also apply for the E2 visa. But you have to make sure that you are able to maintain at least 50% ownership all the time. This requirement will continue when you renew your E2 visa later. So you should consult with an immigration attorney whenever there is any change of ownership structure in your E2 business. The next requirement is that you must have a substantial investment. Then what is a substantial investment? Well, we'll talk about it in more detail later, but generally speaking, it means that sufficient amount to make the E2 business fully operational. For example, if your business is a consulting company, then obviously the required fund to establish and start the business are a lot less than the manufacturing facilities. However, well, can you claim that your consulting company only needs $5,000 to make it fully operational? Probably that's not enough to meet the immigration officer's review standard. In that regard, we generally recommend to invest minimum $50,000 regardless of your business type. But I'm sure Kelly will address this issue in more detail later on. For now, let's go over with each bullet point here. Funds must be at risk. It means the wire transfer investment fund must be used and spent. For example, you transfer, let's say, $100,000 to the E-2 business account. Then you need to spend the money to obtain all kind of necessary stuff, that's including office lease, office equipment, other professional accounting, legal, or marketing services. You will need to show that you have spent sufficient amount out of the $100,000 in your E-2 visa application. The next requirement is the source of fund. Any legit source can be used, but please keep in mind the government wants to see very clear fund flows from the documentations. So you should try hard to keep it simple and easy for the government officers to understand how funds were originated and how it came to the E-2 business account. Okay. How much is enough? Again, we generally recommend you invest and spend at least $50,000 regardless of the type of your business, but we will discuss more details in next slide. Typical E-2 expenditures. So this bullet point is to show you how you should spend your investment fund for your E-2 visa applications. You do not want to spend several $100s a beautiful dinner with a potential business partner and claim it as a business expense. In real life, yes, you could claim it for the company's tax deduction purpose, but such is not highly recommended for E-2 visa application. So keep in mind that inventory, equipment, website, office supplies, office warehouse rent, marketing business entity setup, these are the most preferred expenses for your E-2 visa case. Next slide. The next requirement, business cannot be marginal. This is the whole point why US government is giving you an E-2 visa. The E-2 business is supposed to contribute to the local economy and job market in the United States. So if your E-2 business is barely making incomes just enough to cover you and your family members' living costs, unfortunately government would not like it. So therefore, you should keep in mind that your E-2 business should create enough incomes to hire US employees all the time. You can even hire employees before you apply for the E2 visa and submit the application. Such would actually strengthen your E2 visa application. So if you think if your investment is kind of low, you have some kind of risk, it may be really good strategy to hire a US employee before you submit the visa application. Business must be real and operating. What it means is that when you submit your E-2 visa application, your business must be already fully ready to operate or already up and running by hired US workers. To prove this element is satisfied, you will usually need to sign the commercial lease agreement, the corporation registration document with the state government, print out from the company website, maybe contracts with the potential customers, licenses if it is needed. Those will all prove that your company is fully ready to operate. Next, you will solely develop and direct the E2 enterprise. This requirement, it simply means you are coming to the United States only for your E2 business. So your E2 business is going to be basically your full-time job. You should not like driving Ubers at night as a side hustle or just becoming passive shareholder of E2 business. You should be actively participating the E2 business's daily operations. Okay. The next, you should maintain an intention to return to home country upon expression of your E2 visa. But please note that E2 visa is not a green card, not a permanent residency, and it does not automatically lead to a green card either. But some other countries like UK, if you stay 5 years for certain types of visas, you will get like eligible for the green card. US doesn't have that kind of system, unfortunately. It only allows you and to enter United States for temporary period to develop and run your E2 business. But it does not mean that you cannot renew E2 visa or obtain US permanent residency. You will be able to renew it and eventually go after US green card. But you should carefully develop your green card case direction with an immigration attorney. The next one is options for the starting point. So you may start the brand new business or buy an existing business. If you are considering buying an existing business, you should also consider a business that already has a good number of employees. Because again, having existing employees before the visa application submission is really good plus point. Okay. Also, you could arrange an escrow consideration in the transaction when you buy a business. This is one exception to the requirement where I said that you should have spent enough money before the applying it to visa application. The contract language in this type of transaction will say that the transaction money will be held in escrow account and will be released to the seller upon approval of your E2 visa application. It will also say that if your E2 visa application is denied, then the funds will be returned to you. So because the existing business has already everything set up, you do not need to spend the money to buy many stuff. Is also good consideration for the buying a business. Next slide. How long is E2 visa valid? It depends on the treaty agreement between the United States and your home country. It could be very short, like 3 months. It could be maximum 5 years. But if you get 3 months of E2 visa, let's say, it does not mean you will be allowed to run your business only 3 months. Regardless of visa validity duration on your passport, you will typically get 2 years of E2 status when you come to the United States. Okay, the CBP, the immigration officers at the airport, will give you an issue of immigration form called I-94, which will state your authorized stay as E2 status inside the United States. And regardless of how many years or how many days left on your E2 visa, you will usually get 2 years. So when your E2 visa is already expired, but because your E2 visa validity duration is very short, you need to go out from the United States. Once you go out from the United States, then you have to reapply your E2 visa again. Okay? It can be interpreted the other way. You have 5 years of E2 visa, but you only get 2 years of E2 status by I-94. It simply means you just go out from the United States, come back again, to refresh the I-94 duration. Okay. How much investment is enough? The regulations do not specifically state the minimum investment amount for E2 visa case. But as you know, EB5 green card case requires a minimum investment like $800,000, but E2 visa doesn't have such requirement. This means you could get approval even with $50,000, depending on the type of business. More importantly, you need to show that amount is enough to make the business fully operational. It should be looking reasonable to the government officer. That is why we usually recommend investing at least $50,000 to meet the government officer's review standards. Sometimes government applies what is called a proportional test. Okay, this usually comes up in a kind of very large investment settings like $1 million, pharmaceutical factories. In that case, you do not need to spend 100% of your investment fund before you apply. But since we are talking about smaller and riskier investment cases today, I would generally say that the proportional tests do not usually apply. For the small businesses, it's usually better if you spend 100% or very close to 100% of your total investment fund before you submit the applications. If you are buying a business, okay, you may wonder what counts as a substantial amount. Usually it means fair market value. Okay. Well, to find out what is fair market value for the particular business, you may hire a business appraiser or get an evaluation report, but usually that's not required. Okay. Next slide. If your E-2 visa case is kind of weak because your investment amount is not much, you may want kind of strengthen other aspects of your case. Hiring a U.S. worker before you submit the application is probably one of the best steps you can take. Another thing you could do is show that your E-2 business already has a demand from the potential clients or business partners in the United States. Okay, a signed contract like or MOU or letter of intent from potential client can be very useful as well. You could also get a letter from the local chamber of commerce where your business will be located. Okay, such letter would help to show that your E-2 business will create jobs and provide value to the local community. This kind of supporting letter from the local chamber of commerce make a huge difference in the kind of low investment case. You also business plan is one of the requirement documents, but a strong business plan showing your marketing and competitive strategies and your projected financial revenues and how many employees you plan to hire over the next 5 years. Those kind of strong presentation by business plan will also help to overcome kind of risk and the low investment cases. That's why when our firm prepares one, it is usually more 30 pages and it is designed to strengthen the case and meet the immigration officers the review standards. Okay. A CPA letter can be also used. This type of letter basically says that the accountant reviewed the financial sections and based on their experience, the investment amount is sufficient and startup cost is also sufficient enough to operate the business. But you could be more creative to strengthen a low investment case, but these are the typical ways we recommend. Okay. Next. The next slide is about common E-2 visa expenditures. If you look at the list, basically this list shows that the typical areas where E-2 investors spend money and when they're establishing their E-2 company. So of course, the exact expenses could be it could be different depending on the type of business you are operating, but this list should give you a general idea of where investment fund should be usually spent. Okay. One important point to remember is that While these are generally considered as a good expenditures, we do not recommend concentrating all of your spending in just one or two categories. Okay, please do not spend your whole investment fund for the like buying a computers or paying rent for the next 24 months. No, instead of uh, instead of focusing on a couple of criteria here, it is usually better to distribute your E2 investment fund across the different categories that are relevant to your business. Okay, that's the key point. Okay, okay. With that in mind, let me turn over to Kelly, who will guide you through more the next more the detailed part of our presentation, how to wisely spend the money, and how to improve your E2 case from the difficult challenges. So stay tuned.
Thank you, Yongki. All right, so we've talked about some strong expenditures. These are kind of some weak expenditures. These are just things we don't recommend including because they will not only kind of be discounted, but also sometimes kind of weaken your case in the eyes of the reviewing officer. So, for example, travel, anything related to flights, specifically flights to the US to kind of, explore, those things are not considered to be good business expenses for the E2. A car, and this one really will depend. So, it's if it's you're getting a car because you need a car, just to kind of drive to and from work, then it's really not a good expense and not one we would recommend including. However, if it's something that's, necessary for the business, like let's say you're doing a mobile grooming business, so you obviously need, a van that's going to be, fitted out in a certain way, or you're doing a food truck, those types of things, then you can possibly include a car. Similarly, maybe a construction company. But if you're going to include a car, then you really want to make sure you have a strong argument, and it really should be used primarily for business purposes and not also as kind of your personal vehicle. So, hotel, also not a strong expense. Meals, transportation, none of that is considered to be a good E2 expense. Entertainment for clients as well. And the last one here, expenses paid to related parties. And so, this would refer to something like, let's say you own a company abroad and it provides website design services, and your US company needs a website. If you are going to have your US company pay your other company for website design services and you own both companies, if that comes to light, the officer could view that as you not really putting money at risk or irrevocably committing any money. They would look at it as you just transferring money from kind of one company you own to another. That also goes for kind of, family businesses. If you have kind of your spouse has a business, and you're kind of paying them, it's not to say that, it's prohibited, but it's just not a very strong expense. And if the officer discovers it, it could call into question, other parts of the application. So better to avoid it if possible. All right, let's talk about some specific challenges and tips for consulting businesses. We do a lot of E2 consulting businesses, so it is a very viable approach. That being said, it can, have certain challenges to it. So one is that theoretically a very low investment or sometimes no investment is really needed to start a consulting business. It's very common for our clients to come to us and say, we really want to get the E2, but, I have my laptop, I have my connections, I made my own business plan, I don't have anything to spend money on. And in order to get the E2, you will have to invest a substantial amount. So there is that aspect of it. Well, as an entrepreneur, you may want to spend as little as possible, and that makes sense. As an E2 investor, you do have to be willing to, invest that substantial amount to, show the officer that you are committed to successfully operating, this business, and that you've irrevocably committed and put at risk the capital to start the business. Um, so that being said, we do encourage people to spend money on things that make sense for their business, right? So one thing to do would possibly be to look out, 1 year, 2 years. What would you be spending money on? So office space, can you prepay for that? Equipment, right? If you have employees you're going to hire at the end of year one or maybe in year two, maybe you purchase that equipment now. Marketing, maybe you're fine going with a bare bones website. Maybe instead you pay for, a better website, or you hire, a marketing agency to do a study for you. Hiring employees, right? So let's say that you're going to hire an office assistant at the end of the year. Maybe you hire that person earlier to help you with some of the startup. And then anything you pay that employee and anything related to that employee peripherally, like, payroll costs, those can all be included and are good E2 expenses. Also important to spend over kind of a wide variety of categories. So it doesn't look good, for example, to say, well, I spent $40,000 on marketing and I spent $150 on some pens. You really want to think about spending in a variety of categories to show the officer I've spent everything necessary to get this type of business up and running. And that's usually going to be things like commercial office space, software, hardware, inventory, marketing costs. So you do want to just show you've spent in the normal variety of categories. And then depending on your specific type of business, there might be others that are required. Like if you're opening a restaurant, then obviously you would need a lot more equipment, related specifically to that. Also important if you can get articles that show, what are the costs to get this type of business up and running. So there's a lot of articles out there and trade magazines or business publications about the low cost of starting up a consulting business. So that can be very helpful. Um, and, again, like for consulting businesses, if you're really struggling, with trying to get that investment amount up, one of the best things that you can do is to hire an employee. Because one of the concerns they have with consulting businesses is that the person is going to come in and operate as a solo consultant. And that's not what the E2 visa is for. The E2 visa is really for people who are coming to develop and direct a business that is going to hire workers in the United States. And so, hiring that employee helps your application in multiple areas, not just getting your investment amount higher, but also showing that you meet that marginality requirement that you are going to hire people in the United States. So we can go to the next slide. Perfect. So real estate investment. So this can be a tricky category because there's a misconception that you can kind of purchase a property, and that can be your substantial investment. And so even on some consulate websites in their, FAQ section about E2s, they'll have a question that says, can I purchase a property and put it in the name of an LLC and that's my investment? And the answer is no, because that's not a real and operating enterprise and doesn't qualify for the E2. So when you're going in for a real estate company, you really want to think about framing it because the officer is going to be scrutinizing it closely to see, well, is this person just kind of passively owning property and collecting rental income? So things that have worked for our clients in the past. One would be a real estate brokerage firm, a property management company, renovation construction, house flipping if you're doing it on a large scale. For example, we had a client who had, a portfolio of, 35 to 45 homes, right, that they were actively flipping. And they had, staff of people who are working on getting those homes, up and ready. That being said, that investment amount did have to be very high because to have that large of a real estate portfolio and to pay for all of the upgrades that are going to make this into a real and operating business, the investment amount had to be quite high. Also important, to show that you're going to have employees for the company. And also consider licensing. So, for example, if you're going to do, be a brokerage or you're going to do construction, very often there are state-specific requirements in relation to that. So maybe you need a general contractor's license, and there's some states where you need a social security number before you can apply for some of these licenses. So for some of our clients, they need to either kind of partner locally with other people who already have these licenses until they'll be able to get them. Or maybe you might be able to get it in advance. But either way, you want to kind of look into that, like what is the licensing requirements in the state that you want to operate in, and make sure that you plan for that. As often they will ask about it, at the interview. Okay, so equity trading companies, they have a lot of the same consideration as real estate. So, just again, like putting your stock portfolio in the name of a company is not going to qualify. They're just concerned, are you doing day trading? Are you doing personal investing? Or are you really developing a company that's going to be a bona fide enterprise, and actually operate and hire workers in the US? It's also a highly regulated industry. So if you're doing something like you're doing a hedge fund or something like that, you need to show that you have kind of all the proper corporate structure, that you have licenses if any are needed, and have to convince the officer that your business is not passive. So a business plan can be very important for this type of business to outline exactly what services you're offering, why you're allowed to offer those, why you have the expertise, and that you'll be able to actually hire workers in the US to support the business. Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about the E-2 visa denials and what are some common reasons for denials. So one would be low investment amount, low investment amounts. We've been talking about kind of strategies that you can use to make the case stronger despite those. That being said, some investment amounts are just going to be too low, right? So we had a client, for example, who came to us and had spent $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. That is not ever going to qualify, for the E-2. We advised this person on how to spend. They ended up spending around 50,000, went back and ultimately got their case approved. So if you are denied for low investment amount and you do have working capital available or more investment you could add, this is one of kind of the easier denial reasons to overcome, in the sense that if you can build a strong case as to why you've increased your investment, often you can kind of go back and overcome this denial reason. Nature of the business. So as we talked about, there are certain businesses like consulting, real estate, equity trading, where they'll look at them more closely, and you just need to be making sure that you're preparing the case as strong as possible, so that they feel comfortable that it does meet all those E-2 requirements. Filing location and venue. So, although the law is the same, it is applied differently in different consulates, and they have different, views on kind of what counts as substantial investment. And there are some consulates that are more familiar with E-2s and some that are less familiar. And over the years, foreign service officers will kind of cycle through different consulates. And so you get different interpretations of what counts as substantial over the years or what meets the qualifications. Sometimes certain consulates get fixated on, having employees before you submit your case, which is not required, but if you have an officer that just really gets fixated on that, it can be hard to overcome. So you do want to kind of discuss with your attorney, what are your options for your filing location? If you're in the United States, can you potentially file with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services? They have the benefit of being, easier on kind of lower investment amounts, but much, much harder on source and trail of funds. So there's kind of different strategic considerations about why you might want to file in different places. There have been limitations, on kind of third country national consular filings. So you're pretty much limited to wherever you are a resident or wherever you hold a passport, if you're going for a consulate. But just very important to understand the trends, because, for example, there's some consulates that are used to seeing primarily huge multinational businesses sending E-2 employees. Those consulates may be less friendly to the small investor who's investing $80,000. So you want to just be aware of that to understand before you, go ahead, what your, chances are, or what your, options are based on, where you can file. The next two reasons are kind of intertwined. So, this is marginality, like will the business create jobs? So if you have a history of running a business in your home country for many years and you never hired anyone, it may be harder for them to believe that you will hire someone just based on a 5-year business plan. So in that case, it may be very beneficial to you to actually hire someone before you file, just to kind of address that concern before the officer even gets to it. Um, Issues with the adjudicating officer. So consular officers are human beings. They have different levels of training. They have different kind of, directions on what should qualify or what they're seeing. So if you do feel like you got, a really difficult officer, you want to be as polite as possible. They have complete, discretion over whether to grant or deny the visa. And it's very difficult to kind of get them to look at a decision again, unless there's just an extremely objective, thing that they got wrong. But most of the time with the E-2 cases, that's not the case. That being said, you can always reapply, and most of the time, the consulate will try to give you a different officer. It's not guaranteed at all, but in my experience, they do actually really try to give you a different officer. Um, Another reason might be you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So sometimes you prepared the case on your own. Maybe not an immigration attorney, prepared it for you, and you didn't meet those requirements. So that would be something like the treaty country national doesn't own or control a majority of the business, or at least 50% of the business. Or you have purchased a business completely through a loan that is secured by the assets of the E-2 business. So nothing is actually invested or at risk. So in those cases, you would just need to revisit your case, see if it's possible to change it so that you meet those requirements, and then refile. All right, let's talk about some adjudication trends. So government posted approval rates are between 80 and 90%, relatively high for the E-2, and our approval rate is in the high 90s. Although, of course, past results do not predict future outcome. No one can ever guarantee that your visa or immigration benefit will be approved. In terms of timelines, London right now is a bit on the longer side. So taking, about 90 to maybe 120 business days to review a case. And then you can usually get an appointment within 1 to 2 months. So a several month process in London. In Toronto, they're reviewing cases in about 15 business days, and then you can usually get an appointment within a month or two. That is kind of a moving target. There's sometimes where you log in and you only see, an appointment a few months away, maybe even November. But often, if you continue logging in, you can get an earlier appointment. In terms of timelines generally, it is kind of again all over the place and kind of a moving target. There's many consulates where processing times are a few weeks, particularly in Europe. There, can be faster, like Frankfurt, for example, even though publicly listed processing time is 60 days. Often it can happen, a bit faster. That being said, you want to be thinking about your timelines in months, right? Not days or, a couple weeks. It usually does take longer because they have to review it in advance. Then you have to get your appointment, and then there's a couple weeks where they will collect your passport and need it for visa stamping. All right, USCIS versus the consulate. So if you're in the United States in a valid status that allows you to change status, like you're here on an H-1B and you want to start a business, or you're here on a B-1 and it's better for you to change status than go back to your home country, then you could do a change of status to E-2 with USCIS. A benefit here would be that you don't need to leave the US. You also don't need to attend an interview. Everything is decided on the papers. The downside is you're only going to get a 2-year approval that allows you to stay in the US and run the business, but does not permit international travel. So let's say you get an approval, you've been here for a year, you have to leave, there's an emergency, you leave the United States, you cannot come back on the basis of that approval. You have to go to a consulate and submit a brand new E-2 visa application. So they don't need to rely on the USCIS approval the way they do for some other types of visas. So important to keep in mind. Um, also another important thing is just that ESTA does not permit a change of status. So let's say you've entered on ESTA and you're here for business reasons, you cannot change to E-2 status. Um, so for the consulate, I'd say, more people kind of will apply through a consulate normally, because they're already outside the United States. Again, you want to know, what are your consular preferences? What are the things that they, are looking for? That being said, for a consulate, a benefit is that one, they take a more holistic view of the source and trail of funds than USCIS. And another is that usually you will get a multi-year, multi-entry visa. So that's not the case for everyone. There are some nationalities that have, a very short reciprocity period on their visa. But for many, many, E-2 applicants, it's kind of better to apply at the consulate and you can get that visa to allow for international travel. Sometimes, a 5-year visa even, which really allows you to build up the business and get it to a successful place before you have to renew. You do want to, again, just know your post. There are instructions that each consulate has about how to submit things, particularly ones that have a high volume of E-2s. They also have preferences, some different file sizes, bookmarks. Some of them want business plans, some don't want business plans. Some of them require a CPA certification of the financials of a business plan. So these are all important things to keep in mind and to check in advance while preparing your application, as just because your friend got an E-2, if they're applying at a different consulate than you, your application process could look significantly different. All right. right. So some issues in complex areas for E2s. So one, do you have to hire employees before you apply? And the answer is no. That being said, there are some consulates where they really focus on this. And so if it's possible to hire an employee before applying, it can be very favorable to your case, not only to show you meet the marginality requirement, but also anything that you have paid to that employee can be used as part of your E2 investment. A complicated source and trail of funds. So, for USCIS filings, they do a very, very deep dive into your source and trail of funds, and they want to see a lot more documentation than a consulate. Most consulates have page limits. They take just a very holistic view of that source and trail of funds, where they might say, all right, it's your personal savings from employment. Let's just see a couple of years of tax returns. And if that supports the amount, that's generally sufficient. Versus with USCIS, they would want to see your tax returns. They would want to see your pay stubs. They would want to see your money entering your bank account and being maintained there. So if it was all spent on something else, then that won't count. And you actually have to show that maintenance of funds. If it was transferred to different bank accounts, you have to show that transfer. So if you do have a very complicated source and trail of funds, maybe from many years back, they still will want that trail. And it may be better to either find another, source of funds or maybe do a consular filing. For loans and gifts are permitted as sources of funds. For loans, it has to be a personal loan, secured or unsecured. It cannot be secured by the assets of the E2 business. So if it's secured, let's say you own a property personally and you take out a second mortgage, that's fine. What would not be fine is a seller financing arrangement where, the entire thing is secured by the assets of the E2 business. A gift is also fine, but the gift giver has to be willing to give you their financial documents so you can see the officer can see where the money came from. E2 visas for two investors. So this is possible, but it has to be 50-50 ownership. And the investment should also generally be, 50-50. You can't have kind of one investor investing 100,000 and one investor investing 5,000. That's not going to work. Although if it's a little bit, more reasonable of a difference, you could potentially make that argument. Um, Substantive changes to the E2 business after filing. So sometimes people will get a 5-year visa and they think, great, I can work in the US. And it's important to understand that the visa is more limited than that. The E2 visa allows you to work for the company that you outlined in your application, doing what you outlined in that application. So if at any point you no longer meet the E2 requirements, there's a change in ownership and you no longer own 50% of the business, this means that you're no longer eligible. And even if you have a valid visa, you should not continue to use it if you no longer meet those requirements. If there are substantial changes to the business, like you're changing the type of your business, you started a consulting company and you're closing it down and opening a restaurant. Before you do that, you need to get an approval for that substantial change. That being said, let's say that you want to do, software consulting, but 3 years down the road, you want to, do mobile app development. You can contemplate that in your business plan to show here's the outgrowth of the business, here's the direction we're going in, and that can help, with the argument that it wasn't a substantial change. But you do need to present that to the officer when you get your initial E2. Family business purchases. So if you are purchasing a business, they usually will accept that, the fair market value of the business is what it's being offered for on the open market. If it's a family member, then the amount that you are paying needs to make sense in light of the financials of the business. If it's like a very successful, very valuable business with a lot of assets, and your family member is selling it to you for $20,000, that's not going to work, right? Like they're going to want to see some objective, valuation of the business price, either, getting a CPA to weigh in on the financials or getting an objective valuation from a valuation company can be very helpful there. The impact of the new administration. So executive orders, related to immigration are numerous. There's none specifically on the E2. That being said, what it means is that all visa applications are undergoing significant scrutiny. In particular, if you have any criminal issues, even if you have gotten a visa in the past and been vetted, you cannot expect that it will not be an issue on your renewal application, or even that they may not revoke your visa proactively before that. So we are seeing a lot of people who have, DUIs, for example, even if they're many years old, experience unexpected visa revocations and needing to reapply for their visas. So you do want to just really go over your immigration history in detail. Do not assume that just because an overstay or a violation or a criminal issue was not a problem in the past, do not assume it won't be a problem today, because what we're seeing is that these are becoming issues on these applications. Um, Also, higher investment, higher employee numbers. These are things that are definitely on their radar, to strengthen your case. Investments in the US. So you don't want to be spending all of your money outside the United States. It's not a requirement that you make the substantial investment in the US, but it's much better for your case if you do so. And we are seeing officers focus on this. Approval rates didn't change much from 2016 to 2020, and we're seeing a similar thing here, but again, we are seeing those hiccups of people maybe having their visas revoked unexpectedly or having harsher adjudications when there is any criminal history.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. That was very helpful presentation. Let's go ahead and take a look at some questions. Okay.
Okay, so someone has asked, I have documented investment funds in local currency, but due to local banking restrictions, US dollar transfers are unavailable. I can use external exchange entities or third-party transfer routes, but will not be documented. So I think that uh, like it's okay if you're making transfers through third parties, but they have to be documented, right? So there would need to be, if you are, transferring it from yourself to, a friend who's then transferring it, like whatever it is, you do have to document it. So it can be acceptable to do this, even with there's a restriction on US transfers, but you do have to document each step in order for that to work for the E-2. Right. Someone said my brother and I are buying a franchise for 700,000 with 150 down. He will secure a loan for the remainder, and I'll own 51%. So, for these very specific questions, I would suggest you set up a consultation. But generally, I would say no. This structure doesn't really work, because if you're only doing a down payment and the total cost is 700,000, and the majority is going to be a secured loan, then it would be very difficult to argue that you've spent a substantial amount based on the proportionality test. Um, does applying for a change of status inside the US create any risk or negatively affect my E-2 visa application when I later apply for a visa stamp at the embassy? So we have many clients who have done this. This became a very popular thing, especially during COVID. That being said, every now and then it can create some risk. Sometimes consulates do not like it when you enter the US, for example, on a certain visa and you change your status, to another visa. So I would say the risk is low. But it does depend on kind of where you're going and what the trends are at the consulate at that time, because there are times when consulates kind of get pressured about people getting a visa for one thing, like a tourism or business visitor visa, and then changing their status and then coming back. So I'd say we've done it very frequently without much issue, but I think it is a nuanced, I wouldn't say there's no risk. I think that there can sometimes be risk depending on which consulate you're going to. Um, for an agricultural business, would land that is bought to grow things as part of the investment amount count? Yes, it certainly could. You just want to be careful about whether there's a mortgage on it, because again, if there's a mortgage and you are only paying, a small portion of a deposit, then that likely wouldn't be considered substantial. Um, okay, Yongki, would you like to
Yeah,
take this next one?
sure. I have two questions. Is coaching also considered consulting? Well, depending on what kind of coaching you provide. If you provide professional services, like for example, like fine accounting, that kind of stuff, then it might be considered consulting. If you're providing personal coaching, maybe it's considered as a coaching. Point is, it does not matter. Either options, it's very eligible for the E2 case. So you can go ahead and proceed with whatever coaching business model you prefer. Second, is there a difference between starting a company when you live in Canada or you live in Belgium? Uh, Basically, there is not much difference if you are eligible either countries. Currently, U.S. Department of State requires you to apply E-2 visa where your the nationality is or your residency is. So if you require either, if you are meeting the requirement by the passport requirement or residency requirement, you could choose Canada or Belgium. It doesn't make any difference for the your E2 visa starting point.
Yeah, perfect. Can I purchase a business to operate my business instead of renting? Yes, you can. But again, like you want to just be considerate, like considering the mortgage, and then it doesn't eliminate the requirement to spend everything necessary to get the business up and running. So just buying a building and not making any other expenditure would not work. You'd still have to make other expenditures based on the type of business you're starting. Someone said E2 visa is not unlimited renewal. So I'm not sure if this is a question, but I will say the E2 visa, there is not a limit like there is on the H1B, where after 6 years you can't keep extending it. For the E2, as long as you continue to meet all the E2 requirements, you can continue to extend or renew your visa. Uh, Someone's asked, is purchasing a car mechanic shop for 500,000 a good business? Potentially, what you want to look for when you're purchasing a business is you want to look at the last 3 years of tax returns. How are the profits? How are the revenues? Are they consistent or growing? And if not, that doesn't look as good. Also, have they hired people consistently? Are they paying them? Very important, they're being paid on the books, that you can see W-2s. I would recommend that you don't want to buy anything that has less than 3 full-time employees. Those can be considered marginal businesses. If you keep adding employees, can you apply for an EB-5 if you meet the money and employee requirements? Potentially, however, things that can be counted for E2 investment are not always the same for EB-5 investment. So if you do want to do an EB-5, uh, it is important that you plan from the beginning, and you have to add 10 total employees using that investment. So it is quite difficult to do, but you do have to just plan in advance. Is an E3 change of status to E2 possible? Yes, if you meet the requirements and you're in valid E3 status. Currently, our family live in non-E2 country. My wife has a passport from an E2 country. The plan is to apply in the country of her passport. Is this allowed? How would it work? Do you need to include it in your business as being employed? So, if you do have a passport from an E2 country, then generally, yes, you can apply in that country. There is an exception for the UK. If you are applying with a UK passport, you have to be resident in the UK in order to use that passport to apply. So living outside the country would be problematic in that instance. E2 spouses can work. They can work in the United States based on their E2 spousal status. You do not need to work for the E2 business as an E2 spouse. Yonki, do you want to take the next one?
Sure. If I'm presently retired, can I still apply for E2 visa? Yes. Your age doesn't really matter. E2 visa doesn't have any age discriminations, so you could apply for it. Next question. Is it advisable to apply E2 visa at consular or within the change of status? Kelly already explained about the huge difference between the USCIS versus consular application. So basically, if the uh, investment is kind of risky and low amount, maybe USCIS is better options. But please remember that you will have a travel restrictions.
Right. And this is very client specific. So if you do
Yep.
want to talk this through, I would suggest setting up a consultation. Does a denial with an E2 make getting a future E2 or other visa harder? Potentially, yes. It depends on the reason for the denial, right? So if it's just you didn't invest enough money, then I'd say no. If it's because they found some ground of inadmissibility, then obviously, yes. So it would really just depend on the reason for the denial. But you do have to disclose it. Do part-time or contract employees count? Yes, they do. Independent contractors are, I'd say not nearly as strong as W-2 employees. Part-time W-2 employees aren't as strong as full-time W employees. So you're going to make your best argument, and especially if you are someone who like works in construction and you're paying hundreds of thousands to subcontractors, then that's viewed, more positively. But if you have one employee who's a W-2 and the rest are contractors, and you're not paying them very much, it doesn't look as good for the case. Have you had experience with a TPS and applied for an E2? This is a quite complicated situation. And while we have, clients who have experienced this, I'd say set up a consultation because it's very complicated and difficult situation. Can my wife and I and two kids be owners of the business and apply for the E-2? So when the kids turn 21, they can still stay under an E-2 visa. This would be quite difficult to do, I think. You know, often, like one thing that we've seen people do potentially is have their kids apply as E-2 employees once they are older. But in order to do that, you need to the kids have to have a background that makes sense, right? So, like the kids cannot be the investors, and there'd need to be at least 50% ownership. So, if hypothetically, it's possible, but I'd say there's better ways to structure it than all being owners of the business because they couldn't just automatically stay once they turn 21 as owners. They would have to qualify as investors. To be an investor, you have to own 50%, which they wouldn't if there's four of you. And to be an employee, they have to have that work experience that makes sense. So the E-2 employee option is usually one that we see after they've gained some work experience. Um, do you want to take the next one,
Sure.
Yonki?
Can you please elaborate what is considered marginal regarding number of employees you employ? Well, basically, once your E2 visa is approved, we usually recommend to you have 3 to 5 full-time employees for the next E2 visa.
Do you need a Canadian or American CPA for the business plan? I mean, generally, I would recommend an American CPA if you can get one. That's better since it's a U.S. business. For consulting businesses, is 1 to 2 part-time employees to start sufficient? I think that's fine if in the first couple of years that's who you're going to hire. Again, by 5 years, you would want to have more like 3 to 5 full-time employees or more, depending on the type of business you're starting. Uh, Someone's asked if I'm purchasing a business. Do I have to purchase it first or wait till the E-2 visa is received? I imagine I should use escrow. Yes. So when you're purchasing a business, you have two options. One is that you transfer the money directly to the seller, and then you apply for the E-2 visa, and that's a higher risk. The other option would be that you use an escrow arrangement. And so that would be where you sign the purchase sale agreement. All conditions for satisfying the sale have to have been satisfied. And then after that, there's escrow instructions that say the money is going to an independent escrow agent. It won't be released until the E-2 visa is approved. So that's a bit more protective. Someone's asked about the cost for hiring us. Please do contact us, and we're happy to send you our engagement letter to go over that. Someone's also asked about any new rules coming up, like the EB-5 visa this year and coming years. Um, this is a very broad question, right? I would suggest setting up a consult if you'd like to discuss this. There are kind of always changes in immigration going on, especially right now. There are no new kind of pending regulatory changes to the E-2 visa program, as of today. Um, Perfect.
Okay, thank you all for joining us today. We hope that this webinar was helping you to understand how E2 visa works, and see you next time.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.